I don't really necessarily argue that Epstein was exclusively Israeli intelligence. I think he was tied to this network I've been sort of trying to suss out here that involves, organized crime and intelligence and these oligarch figures, private capital, and was ultimately working on behalf of that group that obviously necessitates ties to all of those elements, right? But ultimately, I think, the network he was working for wasn't exclusive to a particular intelligence agency.
Beneath the lurid headlines and courtroom dramas, the Jeffrey Epstein case hides a far darker truth, one that powerful forces desperately want to bury. This wasn't just about a billionaire pedophile. This was about a global syndicate so entrenched in the halls of power that it operates above nations, beyond laws, and behind the curtain of every major institution. Whitney Webb, one of the few journalists brave enough to follow this trail of corruption into the depths, shatters the convenient myth that Epstein worked for just one intelligence agency. The reality? He was a critical asset in a hydra-headed network where intelligence operatives shake hands with mafia bosses, where oligarchs and Silicon Valley titans broker deals with warlords, and where blackmail is just another currency. This is the untold story of how the real ruling class operates, a cabal that doesn't need elections or borders because it owns the players, the politicians, and the playing field. The question isn't whether Epstein's network still exists. It does. The real question is, how deep does your denial go? Because if you think this ended with a suspicious suicide in a Manhattan jail cell, you haven't been paying attention. The machine is still running, and it's coming for whatever freedoms we have left. We will now bring you more clips from Whitney Webb's explosive interview to gain more insight. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and enable notifications for additional in-depth content. Thanks for joining us again. Enjoy the video.
So in the case of people like Ratner and people like Epstein, they're accused of major sex crimes, but they also have major connections to, organized crime and or intelligence, right? So I think, in their cases, part of it is motivated by, those other connections behind the scenes. Because if you consider, the early history of Israel, for example, some of these organized crime-linked oligarchs we've discussed, the Bronfman family, for example, instrumental in arming the Haganah, the precursor to the IDF, for example. A lot of these, mob figures collaborated with Mossad, including Lansky himself in the 60s and 70s. Lansky and his illicit empire intimately connected to not just early financial sources and resources for organized crime, like Tibor Rosenbaum. Rosenbaum was also a major funder of Mossad, right? Of early Mossad. And so a lot of these same figures, over time, I would really argue it's a transnational thing, but they have a lot of ties to Israeli intelligence and also to U.S. intelligence. You have figures like that I talk about in my book, for example, like Bruce Rappaport, who's sort of like this international banker based in Switzerland. But he also had a lot of ties to, Israeli intelligence activity, organized crime, was best friends with Bill Casey when he was CIA director and of course before. And that's how you sort of end up finding more often than not that in a lot of the CIA's most controversial activities, they're collaborating with, Israeli intelligence. And arguably that's because they have connections that go even beyond those agencies, because a lot of times when people talk about intelligence related crimes or covert operations, people forget that intelligence agencies aren't necessarily the power there. They work for somebody else. So oftentimes, and as I note in my book, for example, in the case of the CIA, the CIA and its precursor, the OSS, were dominated by Wall Street bankers. And those bankers teamed up with organized crime. It was a mutually beneficial relationship, and the CIA ended up taking over a lot of rackets from the mob, like drug trafficking, because, the mob then, by teaming up with the CIA, gets state protection. A lot of, people that were used in assassination efforts backed by the CIA hired mobsters from the U.S. to do that. And there's a lot of cross-pollination between them, and you arguably, follow it long enough, you can't really tell where one ends and one begins. But, most of the CIA's regime change coups were done on behalf of U.S. multinational corporations and because of, oligarch moneyed interests in the US. And it makes sense when you consider that most of them originally, were Wall Street bankers or from, elite families and had interests in these multinational corporations and all of that. So, it's important. And this is, something I tried to show in my book, is that there's structures behind these intelligence agencies. And when you look at those, a lot of these operations and activities over the years kind of start to make a lot more sense. So I think in the case of Israel too, you have a lot of those elements being there, but they existed before Israel was a state. Israel was created in 1948. The mob in the U.S. teamed up with U.S. intelligence before 1948, and a lot of those mobsters, particularly that were part of the Jewish mob, Bugsy Siegel, Lansky, et cetera, were involved in moving weapons to these paramilitary groups that were later folded into the IDF, including the Haganah. And some of them were big backers also of Menachem Begin and what proto-Likud, I guess. Which is actually interesting because, Lansky developed, basically the reason he was so successful, at least early on, was because he teamed up with aspects of the Italian mafia. So before that, organized crime in the U.S. were sort of in these ethnic silos, Italian, Jewish, Irish, blah, 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 et cetera. And so Lansky—
Before they got intersectional?
Yeah, so Lansky and his associate, Charles Lucky Luciano, teamed up and sort of broke that silo and became, they basically dominated, right? But basically, they were able to be very successful in doing that, and were able to sort of build this transnational empire together. Luciano was deported to Italy around the time that this, their group teamed up with U.S. intelligence, and then was a point man for stuff going on with the CIA in Europe, Operation Gladio, things like that, where basically these false flag attacks were blamed on leftist groups for the purpose of keeping, as many European countries as possible governed by right-leaning governments, and to sort of demonize among the public, more left-leaning political movements, sort of consistent with things that went on in South America, but in a different way, where you have the CIA backing dictatorships extensively throughout the region and during that same period of time.
Power, crime, conspiracy. The Epstein scandal was never just about sex. It exposed a shadow empire where mobsters, spies, and oligarchs collude. Meyer Lansky armed Zionist militias. Tibor Rosenbaum laundered money for Mossad. The CIA absorbed mafia drug networks. Wall Street bankers pulled the strings. This is how the real world works. A deadly fusion of crime and state power, with blackmail as its currency. Epstein didn't fall. He was sacrificed. The system remains. And it's watching. Wake up. Epstein was just the tip of a criminal iceberg stretching from Luciano's Mussolini ties to Jabotinsky's fascist Zionism. His Israeli military tours during prosecution mirrored Lansky's old tricks, while patron Wexner bankrolled Likud-linked programs. This is no conspiracy, it's history. A shadow network where Mossad assets, Silicon Valley billionaires, and Pentagon contractors dance to the same dark tune. The system that protected Epstein still thrives today. The real criminals never go to jail, they own it. Let's watch more clips from the interview.
The Luciano interests were very affiliated with Mussolini and ethno-fascism. And actually, Likud's antecedents, Menachem Begin and his mentor Zev Jabotinsky, developed revisionist Zionism and was explicitly inspired by Mussolini and said we should apply this to Zionism. And so, a lot of these figures that kind of come downstream of this network, these, Wexner and Bronfman and all of that, are very supportive of that fascist model. And that's a big openly admitted reason for the reason they, teamed up in 1991 and created this group, was to direct their philanthropy to promote that kind of ideology and prevent intermarriage, for example, in their particular communities, and sort of, further that kind of idea. But generally speaking, organized crime is very supportive of ethno-fascism, and fascism in general. And arguably the CIA historically has been as well. So, I think it's important, again, to look at the layer behind either, these Israel as a government or the US as a government or the CIA or Mossad or Israeli intelligence, and realize that there's, been more uniting these different factions and groups that kind of goes on in these other realms. And as far as, since you asked about Epstein and the Israeli state, and I kind of got off on a tangent there. He's really alleged to have been working more closely with Israeli military intelligence, not necessarily Mossad. And this comes from people that, were in Israeli military intelligence that worked with him. Of course, his affiliation with the Maxwell family, who are known to have been Israeli intelligence assets, and not just Robert Maxwell, but also, some of his children. Obviously, Ghislaine is, of course, suspected of that. But her sister, who is a big Silicon Valley figure in both the U.S. and Israel, very close to, former heads of Mossad, Shimon Peres, former prime ministers, a lot of powerful connections, allegedly inherited her father's contacts in that orbit, developed very close ties to Bill Gates in the 1990s. Who later, of course, becomes a big Epstein associate, and a lot of other interesting wrinkles there, I guess you could say. And then, of course, there's the case of, Epstein when he was evading charges. He went to Israel to attempt to evade charges, which is actually, I would call it the Lansky model. It's something Mayor Lansky tried to do, not necessarily for sex charges. In Lansky's case, it was tax evasion, but he didn't want to be prosecuted, so he immigrated to Israel until he was basically assured he wouldn't get in trouble, and then comes back and the charges kind of, disappear. And so with Epstein, he, went abroad and didn't come back until his sweetheart deal had been hammered out by people like Alan Dershowitz. But at the time he was, waiting abroad, he was, according to local reports in like Palm Beach, the Palm Beach Post, for example, Epstein was touring military bases in Israel. So that's kind of interesting. If you're just a regular guy charged with a crime in another country, and you're going to go visit another country and tour their military bases, doesn't really make a lot of sense unless there was some other, notable connection there. And it's worth pointing to that, Leslie Wexner in particular, through his foundations, has had a lot of ties to Israeli government officials. He has, the Wexner Foundation has whole fellowships dedicated to training people that go into Israeli public service. And also, he has been in negotiations on and off, not recently, but I think back in the 90s and 80s about, setting up ventures in the occupied Golan Heights, for example, in, direct connection with Israel's government and things like that. So there are a lot of interesting overlaps, to say the least.
When the U.S. Virgin Islands pried open J.P. Morgan Chase's internal correspondence in June 2023, reporters found more than careless compliance. They found a modern field manual for the covert economy Whitney Webb has spent years mapping, a place where bankers, billionaires, spies, and criminals trade favors as casually as they swap business cards. The emails between Jeffrey Epstein and Jess Staley, then the bank's investment bank chief, showed Epstein choreographing introductions to Gulf royals, Chinese officials, and Silicon Valley rainmakers, while J.P. Morgan's own anti-money laundering staff screamed to cut the cord. Staley ignored them, praising Epstein's brilliant expansion strategies and inviting him to shape multi-million-dollar decisions. The picture was too close to Webb's description of a hydra-headed syndicate to dismiss as coincidence. Here was a felon already convicted of child procurement, serving as geopolitical concierge to a Wall Street giant. That revelation threatened to turn the scheduled October 2023 civil trial into a financial and reputational mauling, but J.P. Morgan made sure no jury would ever hear the evidence. First, the bank wrote a $290 million check to a nationwide class of Epstein survivors. Then it settled with the Virgin Islands for $75 million, adding a public pledge to tighten its human trafficking screens. For the victims, those sums mattered. For the institution, they amounted to less than 1/4's profit, and they bought the one commodity the bank prized above all: finality, without an admission of wrongdoing. The deal also froze discovery, sparing Jamie Dimon and other senior executives additional questioning about why they tolerated Epstein until 2013. In Webb's framework, where fines are a cost of business and guilt rarely punctures power, the settlements looked like textbook damage control. If JP Morgan hoped the checks would sluice the scandal from public memory, the next 2 years delivered a different narrative. In January 2024, a New York judge released a tranche of long-sealed filings from a 2015 suit against Ghislaine Maxwell, identifying scores of influential people tangled in Epstein's world. The documents did not allege new crimes, but they widened the circle of association. Technologists, diplomats, hedge fund founders, all in the same orbit that Epstein had once marketed to Staley. The unsealing fed Webb's larger thesis that Epstein functioned as a clearinghouse, keeping dossiers ready for uses that went far beyond personal profit. Across the Atlantic, Britain's Financial Conduct Authority sharpened the lens on the banker who kept that clearinghouse open. In October 2023, the FCA announced its intention to ban Jess Staley from senior finance roles and fine him £1.8 million for signing a letter that downplayed his ties to Epstein. Staley vowed to fight, setting up a courtroom collision that began in March 2025. During pre-trial skirmishes, the regulator alleged that Staley misled investigators and shared confidential client details, including chatter about Bernie Madoff, with Epstein, behavior the FCA said proved a lack of integrity. The London hearings have already pushed fresh material into daylight. JP Morgan, compelled to cooperate, told the FCA it suspected as early as 2019 that Staley might have been directly involved in Epstein's crimes. Emails released to Staley's lawyers show Epstein coaching him before his 2009 promotion and tutoring him on Chinese real estate strategy, gestures that make the convicted trafficker look less like a client and more like a shadow advisor with astonishing reach. Facing that stream of disclosures, JP Morgan quietly terminated Staley's personal accounts in March 2025, a symbolic rupture meant to distance the bank from its former rainmaker. Staley's counsel counters that he never deliberately lied, framing misstatements as honest lapses, but each hearing seems to expose a deeper lattice of mutual benefit. While regulators pick over Staley's career, the systemic engine that empowered Epstein shows few signs of stalling. The bank's compliance division now trumpets anti-trafficking metrics, and its philanthropy arm funds victim assistance programs in the Virgin Islands, yet offshore due diligence consultancies report Epstein-style shell structures reappearing in jurisdictions with even weaker know-your-customer rules. Intelligence researchers note that many of Epstein's former social nodes, venture capitalists, real estate magnates, emerging market intermediaries, have migrated their networking to encrypted channels and donor-advised funds, structures that law enforcement can subpoena only with great difficulty. The Hydra loses a head, grows two. None of this contradicts Webb. It illustrates her central warning. In her view, Epstein resembled Meyer Lansky in the 1950s, laundering illicit cash for both mob and state, or Tibor Rosenbaum in the 1960s, whose bank allegedly mixed Mossad operations with high finance. The arc of the JP Morgan case reinforces that pattern. A financier already convicted of sex crimes was allowed to funnel more than $1 billion through one of the world's most closely supervised banks, so long as he delivered prized introductions. When exposure threatened, the institution paid settlements large enough to look contrite, but small enough to leave its leadership intact. Today, the same executives navigate new markets with near-record share prices, proof that civic outrage alone seldom fractures entrenched privilege. The Staley Tribunal could, in theory, set a precedent by branding a global banking star personally unfit for the industry. Even that result would be partial justice, a regulatory exile for one man, a mild culture shift for a firm, but no criminal reckoning equal to the scale of harm. If Staley's appeal succeeds, the lesson may instead be that reputational shocks fade and enforcement fatigues. Either outcome fits within Webb's darker model of power. Real authority resides in the spaces where legal penalties can be budgeted like line items, and public amnesia can be bought in quarterly tranches. 2 years after the exhibits first surfaced, the story's outlines are therefore sharper, not blurrier. The public now knows that JP Morgan executives received geopolitical coaching from a registered sex offender, that the bank processed at least $1 billion for him after his 2008 conviction, and that its own compliance chiefs were sidelined until journalists and attorneys pried the facts loose. We know that regulators on 2 continents believe key decision-makers misrepresented those ties, And we know that, despite record-sized settlements, no JP Morgan director has faced indictment. The cumulative evidence turns an old scandal into an ongoing risk assessment. If a global megabank translates political access into profit with almost no personal cost, what disincentive stops the next Hydra head from sprouting? Whitney Webb's answer is stark: none inside the system. External sunlight can scorch, lawsuits can extract millions, but the deeper structure, where intelligence agencies, private equity, tech magnates, mafias, and banks share personnel and purpose, retools and advances. The Virgin Islands exhibits gave the public a fleeting look at the machinery. The 2024 unsealings added new names. The 2025 FCA fight keeps dripping more emails into the record. Every document underscores the same uncomfortable fact. Epstein's death was not the end of an era, but an opening salvo in a longer confrontation between transparency and entrenched supranational power. The machine is still running, its gears now grinding a little louder, and the question that confronted readers in 2023 echoes more urgently in 2025. How much longer can a society insist on justice without confronting the systems that profit from injustice? Thanks for watching. Please remember to hit the like button and subscribe. See you in our next video.